Hey guys, this is Joe Romo with the Columbus Symphony Orchestra's Know the Score, hosted by conductor George Del Gobbo. Today's Know the Score will focus on our upcoming concert, Breathtaking Baroque, which includes selections from Corelli, Bach, Vivaldi, and more. Please enjoy this week's edition of Know the Score with George Del Gobbo.
These pieces are very representative of the Baroque period, and they take forms that are pretty standard forms that were used by all the composers of the time. And in this case, for this concert, we're presenting pieces that are the best examples of these forms. I'd like to start, first of all, by talking about the Concerto Grosso. This was a form that was very common in the Baroque period. It was given its final form, if you will, by Arcangelo Corelli, an Italian composer, who standardized the form to include two groups of instruments, a small group called the Concertino. This group could consist of anything, any instruments that happen to be in the piece, but in a string concerto grosso, they are more often than not two violins and a cello. And then there's a ripieno. The ripieno is everybody else on the stage. And the essence of the Concerto Grosso is playing against one group against the other. Corelli did this extremely well, and it's extremely clear and easy to see and hear. So we are playing, he wrote one set of concerti grossi, if you want to be correct about it, concerto grossos. And that set, his Opus 6, was not published until after his death. He did not write any others. He was a very well-known violinist and composer, but he didn't write a lot of music, and a lot of his music wasn't published during his lifetime. This particular one is the fourth of a set of 12 in his Opus 6, and it's one that it's a particular favorite of mine for the fact that it has such energy and clarity and of texture and so on. I find Corelli to be a very attractive composer because his music is so transparent and so easy to follow, and the textures are very clear and clean, and there's nothing extra in them. So that's one example of the Concerto Grosso. The next one would be by Handel, George Frederick Handel, the German composer who lived most of his life in England. And this is also from his Opus 6, and it also includes 12 concertos, and this also is number 4 from that group of 12. Handel was influenced by Corelli a great deal, but you will hear, I think, in the Handel version of a Concerto Grosso, a much more serious and a much more contrapuntal take on what the music should be. And by contrapuntal, I mean instruments playing the same parts at different times, like a fugue. And Handel made good use of that in this Concerto Grosso. The second movement is actually a fugue. And otherwise, it's pretty much the same. All of this music, or much of it, I should say, was based on dance music. As the transition into the Baroque period occurred, what was in the Renaissance predominantly vocal became in the Baroque period predominantly instrumental. But a lot of the dance inspiration for this instrumental music came from dance suites and the dances that were common at the time. So it's very much in evidence here in the Handel piece, and I think that you will enjoy that. The next Concerto Grosso is by Bach. Bach wrote so much music that it's hard to comprehend. It is said that if you started to copy his music by hand, it would take you like 50 years to do it all if you just worked full time at it. He was astonishingly productive in his life and in his musical life especially. And he wrote at one point a series of 6 concertos that he sent off to the Margrave of Brandenburg, whom he had met previously. And he did this in hopes that he would be able to get a job in the Margrave's court. It didn't happen. Bach didn't get the job, which I think is kind of funny that one of the greatest composers who ever lived couldn't get a job when he wanted one. But the music, of course, is still with us. And this particular concerto is number 3 in the set of 6. And it's a concerto that's very much based on threes. There are 3 groups of instruments. Each group has 3 voices, 3 players. So there are 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, along with the bass and the continuo. The continuo refers to the bass line, the instruments playing the bass line, and some kind of chordal instrument. Often it's a harpsichord, but it could be an organ, could be a lute or a theorbo, or almost any instrument that can play chords. And the instruments they used in the period depended upon what was available to them. It wasn't a standardized thing in any way. And this particular Brandenburg is, as I say, in 3 groups of 3. It's in 3 movements, the second movement lasting about 10 seconds. And it's an incredibly complex texture and a weaving of all of these voices together in a way that is much, much more sophisticated than Corelli or even Handel. It provides you with another way of appreciating the writing of concertos for larger groups, not just soloists. And the final concerto is by Vivaldi. Vivaldi was a Venetian, and the folks in Venice had totally different ideas about things. So his Concerto Grosso is really not a Concerto Grosso at all. It's a 3-movement piece. There are no soloists, no concertino, and it's a kind of a fast, slow, fast piece that's kind of like the Italian Sinfonia that was very often used to introduce operas, and which eventually became kind of a format or that was adopted into the formation of the symphony later on. It's a very lively piece, and Vivaldi was a tremendously active composer and teacher. He wrote hundreds of concertos of all different kinds for every instrument available. And this is one of the nicer ones, I think. Then we're going to talk about 2 composers, one of whom you probably know and one of whom you probably don't. The first is Pachelbel, Johann Pachelbel. He lived before Bach. He played in some of the places that Bach would eventually play. He was an organist like Bach, and he was a very well-known organist in his time. He wrote a lot of music, much of which is gone forever. At this time, music was a very much in the present kind of an occupation. You would write a piece for a particular event or for a particular reason. It would be performed, and often then it would never be performed again. So if you wrote a piece for a church service or at the request of your employer for his entertainment, that piece wouldn't be played probably more than a few times. And then much of the music of the Baroque period was lost for a long time. And it wasn't until 100 years later or so, in the middle of the 19th century, that musicians started finding these things and looking in church basements and libraries and turning up the music of even composers as well known today as Bach, whose music went out of favor when the stylistic period, the Baroque period, ended. But Pachelbel, it wasn't really well known after his death throughout the 19th century. And this particular piece that I'm sure you've heard 100 times, the Canon, wasn't discovered until early in the 20th century. And then it has been played many, many times since then. It's been used in movies and commercials and weddings, especially if you were married in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, and you didn't have the Pachelbel canon in your wedding, you're not married. It's that important a piece and that common a piece in those days. Now, the canon is a particular Baroque form that is very easy to understand. It consists of one voice, which is sometimes called the leader, and then that voice is imitated by another voice, which is sometimes called the follower, and maybe even then by another voice and another one even. This particular canon has 3 voices, and if you know the folk song Frere Jacques, or even Row, Row, Row Your Boat, you understand the form of the canon. It's one voice that starts, then the second voice comes in and does exactly the same thing as the first voice, and then the third voice comes in and likewise, and they just follow each other along, and as the first voice goes on to something new, then eventually the second voice takes that up, while the first voice goes on to something new, and so on. And it's quite a remarkable accomplishment to keep this going for 5 minutes, and to keep it interesting, and to keep it all making sense and harmonically and melodically. This particular canon is over a ground bass, and that basically is a bass line of 8 notes that are played before the canon starts, and then that pattern continues and is repeated over and over and over again, causing a lot of cellists and bass players to lose their minds because they have to play it like 28 or 29 times over and over and over again, the same 8 notes. And they're nice notes, but they're not anywhere near as nice as what the violins are doing above them. And finally, we get the Biber, Heinrich Biber, one of the most original composers who ever lived. He happened to live in the early Baroque time, and he was renowned as a violinist, as a virtuoso, and he blazed new trails for violin technique, creating things and inventing chords and ways of playing that no one really had thought of before. He was so inventive that he has written a lot of pieces that employed a technique called scordatura, which means mistuning. So you would take the violin, and instead of tuning it in the traditional way, he would lower a string by a half step, raise a string by a half step, and this gave him the possibility of playing things and playing chords that were very unusual and now were possible because of the mistuning, whereas they wouldn't have been possible if he kept the standard tuning. I hope you can understand what I'm saying here, but it gives rise to very unusual sounding violin music, very expressive, and very much worth listening to. If you're a Baroque fan and you don't know Biber, you need to correct that right away. This particular piece is called Battaglia, which is simply battle, And it was common in those days to write battle music, music that expressed the sentiments that would be raised by warfare. Everything from the actual combat to the mourning afterwards to the whatever emotions would be elicited by war. And this particular piece does that in several movements, going from one emotion to the next, from movement to movement. And there's a prime example of Bieber's creativity. The second movement consists of a number of folk songs and songs of the day, and they are played in succession and together, but each instrument is playing in a different key. So you have basically 7 voices playing in 7 different keys. This is similar to if you just pounded on the piano with your fists any notes. It's totally impossible to figure out what's going on, which in itself conveys a certain emotion related to warfare. It's very striking, and you've never heard anything like it in any other Baroque piece. So, pieces of Baroque music by the greatest Baroque composers, an old chestnut in the Pachelbel Canon, and something maybe a little new for most of us in the Battaglia of Bieber. We are most happy to take the stage again and to be playing music. It's what we live for and what we love to do, and we love to play it for you. And, we much rather have you in the hall, but that can't happen for everyone just now, so we'll get to you however we can, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed this week's edition of Know the Score with George Del Gobbo. If you are interested in supporting the CSO or purchasing tickets, please visit our website csoga.org, and be sure to check out our new digital broadcast pass so you can enjoy the sounds of the CSO from the comfort of home.